Well, good afternoon and welcome to another of my Meet the Candidate events. If you've been attending every Sunday afternoon, you will have been inspired by some of the guests we've already had. We've had the former MSP for Falkirk East, Angus MacDonald. We've had Ivan McKee. And last week we had a fantastic session by Rosa Sally, who could well be Scotland's first refugee MSP. However, next up today on the list is Neil Gray, who is a current or recently just resigned MP for Airdrie and Shotts and is seeking election in the seat of the same name in the Scottish Parliament. So how are you doing today, Neil?
I'm very well, thanks, Michelle. Thanks very much for having me on. I hear what you're saying about your inspirational guests gone past, and I'll try to live up to that billing today as well.
Well, I think it's going to be a great old interesting chat today, because obviously you and I have a great deal in common, having been colleagues for a while in Westminster, and we're both attempting to make this journey into the Scottish Parliament. And I'm sure we've both got thoughts about some of the similarities, but critically some of the differences that might reveal as well. So you've resigned as an MP. Was that a simple matter of writing a letter, or was it different?
So by law, members of parliament aren't actually allowed to resign. You're not allowed to resign as members of parliament. It's this old archaic, as you'd be surprised to learn about Westminster, that this is an old archaic process. So actually, what has to happen is you have to take what is called a role, a job of remuneration with the Crown in order to make yourself ineligible to be a member of parliament. So there are two routes, often known as the Chiltern Hundreds, but the one that I got was the Crown Steward and Bailiff of the Manor of Northstead, somewhere in Scarborough, I believe, in Yorkshire. And I unseated John Bercow, who was the former incumbent. So there's no excuse now for Boris Johnson not to give the former Speaker of the House of Commons his peerage, given that's what's been going on, I suppose. But yeah, so I had to write to the Chancellor to say that that's what I was wanting to do, and then you're given this title, that makes me ineligible, and then the next day they moved the writ for the by-election.
It seems completely and utterly bizarre. And is it because, I mean, I've seen processes in Westminster that they continue to adhere to in the belief that they are historical and should always remain the same. And sometimes that's not a bad reason, but most of the time it's not a very good reason at all. Or is this just simply that nobody has ever thought that anybody would want to resign as an MP? Do you know what the background is?
I genuinely don't know, Michelle. As you will know, there are so many traditions and procedures in the House of Commons that just make no sense in a modern parliament. And part of it, is this old clinging on to tradition that, those traditions are somehow what binds, UK parliamentary democracy. And, if we lose that, then the whole House comes crumbling down. There's a real lack of self-confidence, I feel, in spite of the grandstanding that you see, particularly from this Prime Minister and this Leader of the House of Commons, Jacob Rees-Mogg, there's a real lack of confidence, I think, self-confidence in UK parliamentary democracy, that they're unwilling to see some of these ridiculous, archaic, pointless, holding democracy back procedures from being properly reformed. I mean, there's the mechanism in place in Holyrood, it's far simpler, makes perfect sense. You just resign and that's it. The job's done. But, I have to be appointed to this ridiculous role that doesn't really exist anymore. It certainly doesn't come with any remuneration. I'm off to, check in Scarborough to find out where my fealty is. But, it's just silly. It really is. But that's where we're at anyway.
And I suppose it sounds to me like a bit of a metaphor for where the British state is in of itself, clinging steadfastly to what has been the case before, and almost, as you point out, fearful of looking forwards, looking outwards to what might make things better. Another example that I wanted to kind of tease out is some of the difficulties that the House has had in getting with the programme in terms of using Zoom and allowing people, of course, I mean, I know there's been a variety of iterations, but they seem to be very slow to allow that, when in reality it's about access, allowing people access to hear their elected representatives, allowing access to challenge kind of current thinking. Can you talk us through some of the steps in how they've enabled online debates, and when you've been disabled and so on? Because I think that would be useful for people to understand.
Yeah, so it's not been universal, I think, is the first point to make. They introduced virtual participation so that you could take part at the start, take part in almost all forms of business. There was a scaled back at the start of the pandemic. Business was scaled back. There wasn't virtual voting. So there was no controversial business going through as they tried to find their way through. But then, as the pandemic went on, there was an expectation, as we saw with all the coverage, that things would just return to normal, that somehow the House of Commons could be immune from being able to spread the virus, but needed to return to normal to show leadership to the nation type attitude, which was really reckless. And I think they made a big mistake there in saying, right, everyone's back down the road, we're getting back on with it, and it put parliamentarians, but more importantly the staff of the House, at great risk. And also, if you're going down there mixing and then coming back up the road, you're putting potentially your family and constituents at risk. But like I said, it's not universal. So for some members of Parliament who have been shielding or who have health conditions, they have been excluded from many items of business going through in the last year, and that's about debates on bills and other really important matters that you would want to be getting involved in and making interventions on. They've been excluding people from that. You're not allowed to participate that way virtually, and that speaks to me again. Under this Leader of the House of Commons, Jacob Rees-Mogg, it goes back to what I was saying about a fundamental lack of confidence, I feel, in the traditionalists there at Westminster, who really rail and worry that these traditions are going to, like I say, bring the House down. And it goes back to my time on the committee, the Joint Committee for Restoration and Renewal, when I was sat there with Jacob Rees-Mogg. He was on that committee as well. And the idea of moving to a new parliament, a new parliamentary building, purpose built, was just crazy talk. Couldn't possibly do that. Or talking about electronic voting, this would be crazy. This would be terrible. And there's been the traditionalists there have really been fighting hard in that restoration and renewal process for the decantment to be as short, as brief as possible, because they're really worried that any new practices that happen, such as what we've got just now, virtual participation, virtual electronic voting, or proxy voting, that might somehow creep in and undermine the processes that have been going on for so long, that really don't make any sense, certainly don't add anything of any value to the process of parliamentary democracy. And it makes no sense to me whatsoever. You want your parliament to be efficient, you want it to be accessible, you want it to be open. You look at Holyrood, in that sense, it's a fantastic building in terms of being open and transparent and accessible. When you walk in from the main entrance, you walk past glass-fronted meeting rooms where you can literally see your democracy happening. It's not, back behind smoke-filled rooms and behind closed doors. You can see the processes working. And I just think that is quite the contrast that we've got there before us. And of course, there's
a cost element as well to what they're doing. I mean, I don't know what the latest figures are, but I do recall somebody working out what the kind of cost was per head, per member, if you like, of the old style of voting, of going through the lobbies and so on, which is just ridiculous and completely inexcusable. And that is a cost that is borne by the public purse, as indeed the very expensive costs of refurbishing the Palace of Westminster. And in project management terms, a role I used to undertake many, many lifetimes ago, they have consistently made decisions to go down the most expensive route in terms of the project, not because they're choosing it because it's expensive, but because They're trying to keep the everything intact with no change whatsoever, which means that the project managers, of whom I know one actually working on the project, consistently saying, well, this is going to make a massive budget overrun. And of course, that costs the public purse. I suppose the other thing that I'd appreciate your thoughts about is the attitude now, because obviously I left in 2017, although I've been involved in some banking stuff via various APPGs, but what's your perception now of the current attitude towards the Scottish MPs? How is it at the moment?
Very hostile. I mean, I think it went through a period where there was a bit of a lull, you know, in terms of there was just a bit more complacency towards us, you know, just a bit dismissive. But now it's gone back to being openly hostile because they really see us as being a major threat. So it's a combination of hostility, you know, trying to shout us down, and deriding us, but also just treating us with contempt, and predominantly from the Tory side, but also a large element from the Labour side, and certainly from the Liberal Democrats as well, when they managed to turn up. So it's not really changed from your time when you were there, Michelle, it has to be said, and it's a very hostile place for us. It's obviously not where we want to be doing our business. You know, we want Scotland's national parliament to be our independent parliament, and we want to be able to take all our decisions there. But you know, we are where we are, and while we're here, we have to make sure that we're making the best of it at Westminster in terms of ensuring that Scotland's voice is heard, and doing our best to make the case. And often, the case is made for us best in the way that the Tory government in particular react and treat us, you know, in debates. Yeah, we'll go back to the Scotland bill that you were involved in, you know, in 2015-16, and the fact that they, you know, accepted no amendments. They refused to debate the key issues that we wanted to raise around, you know, delivering on the vow. And we're back there again now with the likes of the internal market bill and so many other areas that are just, you know, out and out attacks on Scottish democracy and devolution.
And I do want to come on to fleshing out some of the detail in what could be empowered or enabled by the internal market bill. But before we do that, one observation I always made that I thought I found it curious psychologically was that when you spoke to some English Tory MPs, as I did when I was like on the Biz Select Committee, they were scathing about the Scottish Tory MPs and actually laughed quite openly about them because they saw them doing their bidding and playing along with trying to put Scotland down, and they really regarded them as quite pathetic. And I thought, I mean, if you were a Scottish Tory MP, how could you live with yourself that lack of respect that what you imagine your colleagues are laughing at you behind your back? And they would do it quite openly because they saw them as so pathetic just doing their bidding. And I actually find that extremely difficult to understand how they could live with that. And I don't know if that's still the same now.
I mean, yes, it is. I mean, you just have to look at the fact that Boris Johnson completely forgot Douglas Ross's name at PMQs this week, Murray Ross, you know. He's going by some other names and some Twitter handles after his Facebook Live appearance not so long ago, but we won't go down that road. But there's a real, there is an antipathy there, but also there's this really strange relationship, you know, around budget time. They get set up for all these, you know, fantastic things that are apparently happening for Scotland in through the budgets, and it's, you know, only because of the hard work of the Scottish Tories that these are getting delivered. But then all the rest of the time, like you say, they're getting completely ignored. So there's a cynicism there in the way that the Tory UK government treats their Scottish colleagues in their own party, that they use them as being, you know, useful pawns for their attacks on us, but then the rest of the time completely ignore them, have no interest whatsoever, and you know, see them as being very provincial. So it is interesting, and certainly from a psychological point of view, in terms of how they treat each other, it's fascinating.
It is,
but deeply depressing as well.
We've got a good question just come in here from Jim Trainer, which I think we probably both have a view on. Is having been an MP any help then in trying to become an MSP? So you answer that first. I've obviously got some thoughts as well.
Yes, I mean, it's a very, very different parliament. I think actually it will, there are 2 apprenticeships that I feel that I've served if I'm successful in becoming a member of the Scottish Parliament. The first is being office manager for Alex Neil and spending 7 years in working in Holyrood and knowing its processes. I think that's going to be really important. But the second one is obviously having been a parliamentarian and getting to know the cut and thrust of a debating chamber and being able to handle yourself means that it's a bit easier, I think, to be able to go into that job. But actually, the fundamental thing for me about being a parliamentarian is having the empathy, having the understanding, being able to deal with people, as well as having the ideas and the ability to communicate what you want to communicate on a parliamentary stage or in a community setting. There's different aspects to it. Having been an MP, I think, helps that. But knowing the Scottish Parliament and having worked with the people I'm keen to represent, I think is the most important to be a successful MSP.
I mean, you make some great points there. If somebody asked me what was the single most important component of being an elected representative in any area or legislature, I would say it's communication skills. Some people, and I know they've been kind of talked about, despising, if you like, their voters, which I think is ridiculous. I mean, if you don't like people, if you don't like working with people, or certainly if you're not prepared to give them a fair hearing and work with them, I think you must struggle. And so communication skills is absolutely vital. And I suppose from my point of view, I mean, I think it's fair to concede, I certainly had a very interesting time as an MP, and focusing absolutely on what it is you're trying to achieve, which for me, I describe it as the North Star of independence. And that's an absolute that I always gravitate back to, but also trying to focus on delivering positive outcomes to make people's lives better. And of course, whilst we want to see our Parliament making all the decisions, was still some things where I felt I could help in terms of making a contribution that would make things better for everybody, regardless whether they were located and not just in Scotland. And I suppose in terms of understanding processes and procedures, yes, of course, they're different in the Scottish Parliament to Westminster, but some of them are similar because legislatures tend to have similar processes and procedures. And I think that will be useful experience as well. So then let's talk about the internal market bill. Now, I know, framing out for the listeners, this is something that's been talked about a great deal by the SNP initially in Westminster. A lot of questions were asked about it, but many people will just say, yeah, we're fearful of this internal market bill, but it would be useful to flesh out what does it mean now and what could it mean as we roll forward for what the Scottish Parliament is able to deliver. So I'd be interested in your thoughts on that.
So in terms of the internal market bill itself, it gives the UK government the power to legislate and spend directly in areas of devolved decision making. That is, in a nutshell, what it allows them to do. And it's just the first, I think, in what will become a series of adventures by the UK government to try to undermine the Scottish Parliament's ability to decide on devolved matters and to be able to deliver for the people of Scotland. So, for instance, you've got the Shared Prosperity Fund, which is to replace EU structural funds. That is obviously going to be what they consider to be a UK-wide scheme. It's going to be delivered by the UK government. They're going to be spending money directly in Scotland on areas of devolved responsibility. You've also got the Towns Fund, the Levelling Up Fund, all these areas that are going to be spending directly in Scotland by UK ministers, which should be done by right by Scottish Government ministers. And I think it's going to become all pervasive, because I spoke in my last speech to the Commons was in a bill called the ARIA bill, which is to deliver a new research and invention agency, which is going to have government funding, UK government funding, and is going to allow riskier investments in scientific and inventive practices. And that is also likely to be a UK-wide scheme that's going to be spending directly in areas in Scotland that should be under the purview of the Scottish Parliament. So I think the danger here is it's not just going to be isolated to the terms of the Internal Market Bill, where it's going to give the UK government the powers, as I say, to undermine the devolved settlement, to bypass Scottish ministers and their areas of responsibility that we have elected them to. You know, we elect the Parliament in Scotland, and by return the Scottish Government, and that is going to be changed, and it's going to be UK government ministers that are going to be, that we don't elect, that we have not elected a Tory government in Scotland for coming up 70 years now, and we're going to be seeing these Tory ministers spending directly in Scotland, undermining the Scottish Parliament, undermining devolution, and pushing their vanity projects. And also, you know, you look at the shared prosperity, the Towns Fund, the Shared Prosperity Fund, the Levelling Up Fund. In all of these areas, the criteria by which you can apply for funding or achieve, you know, the bar in order to get funding is very grey, very woolly. You know, it's not entirely transparent as to how it's working. And there are major complaints across the UK that the money is getting funneled into either Tory target seats or Tory held seats, rather clearly without great need, in order to bolster their support, whereas the areas of real need are getting left behind once again. And it is the worst type of politics that we could see, very dangerous, and certainly very dangerous for the future of the Scottish Parliament.
Yeah, and you make a couple of really, really important points here about democratic scrutiny and accountability. If decisions about spend are forced upon Scotland, that Scotland hasn't voted for, but also cannot critically scrutinise, and let's face it, the Tories aren't going to scrutinise their procurement processes, for example, if they know that they've not gone through the normal channels, which is what we've seen with alarming regularity during the COVID crisis. Also, the thing that I've been pointing out to people is that to whose priorities will these projects be? They won't be the priorities of the democratically elected Scottish Government. They will be to Tory priorities. And we already know that on matters that we hold really dear in terms of decarbonisation, for example, our green agenda, our green ambitions, they may want to push further projects that we fundamentally disagree with. And I think this is going to happen more and more. And I posted up an example today on my blog, on my website, and also a video about the recent moves to try and threaten the Scottish Government's wish to protect children in terms of the Convention on the Rights of the Child. And now the Westminster Government are threatening to take the Scottish Government to the Supreme Court for wanting to pass this legislation, when the legislation itself is fundamentally there to protect children. So given the fact that they say, no, they want to be able to pass laws that they are obviously concerned if they're already enshrined under Scots law, makes you then think, wait a minute, they want to retain that power to make laws for Scotland that may not comply with the rights of the child.
Yeah, and this is why this election is going to be so important, Michelle, because it's obviously about electing local champions, about electing your local member of the Scottish Parliament. It's also about electing the next Scottish Government, which is going to be fundamental to the recovery from COVID. But it's also about our future, and fundamentally, who is it that gets to decide about our economic recovery, the principles of our economic recovery. And we're already seeing, like you say, the skewed priorities of the UK government challenging the implementation of the rights of the child in Scotland, from a social perspective, but also from an economic perspective. You look at the priorities that were meted out by Rishi Sunak at his budget. It was all very much on a spend up front now, but by gosh, you're going to have austerity on stilts to come. And that would be absolutely devastating. We have to remember that during this COVID pandemic, we have had almost independent control of our public health policy. The big areas where we've not have been around borders and around the economic impact of public health. And you wonder how more successful we could have been during the COVID pandemic if we had full control. But imagine what is going to come in terms of the economic recovery if we are not the ones that are deciding our economic future. And that is going to be a fundamental question that we need to ask, is when the time is right, do we want to be independent, and do we want to have control over our own economic decision making to make sure we're not relying on the nonsense that's coming from Westminster, that austerity on stilts is coming down the tracks?
And again, you make some great points. If you remember back to the independence referendum, our good kind of friend and colleague Philippa Whitford was positively pilloried, I seem to remember, by the Daily Record, and I'm putting that on the record, when she suggested that a vote no might have future implications for the NHS, something which obviously is very dear to her heart. And she was making the point that the backdoor stealth privatisation of the NHS in the rest of the UK, whereas key functions have been sort of separated off, they've put them out to tender, and thereby cut the budget for the NHS with a proportionate impact on Scotland's budget for the NHS, which of course the SNP, in absolute credit to them, have continued to protect. But going back to my point about procurement, if legislation is brought through that then forces the Scottish Government, despite their policy view strongly held across Scotland, to do something which they are against, otherwise to be taken to legal account, this is deeply serious. And I do wonder, and I do worry, the extent to which people are really aware of the significant risks to what we hold dear in allowing the Tories any sway over the NHS. You also make the point about education and linking, of course, which is dear to your heart with the work you've been doing. It's not just about education, it's a link with education to the social implications and considerations that a family finds itself in. So if we are going to be subjected to austerity deeper and deeper than we even had after the last recession, that will have a pervasive impact across mass facets of our society.
Huge. I mean, it's all encompassing. The lack of social housing investment in England is part of the reason why they've got higher poverty rates, and part of the reason, conversely, why Scotland has got lower poverty rates, because we have invested in social housing. But if we had a capital spend, a boost to capital spending coming from the UK government that was investing in social housing, by gosh, that would be the right thing to do for the people elsewhere in the UK, but also would have a knock-on effect on Scotland's capital budget, which is getting squeezed very tightly, and allow us to go even further in terms of the work that we're looking to do to ensure that we have a social housing network that makes sure that people are not suffering from poverty. So I think there's a huge impact right now. Our reliance on the decisions that are taken at a UK level have on the outcomes that we expect for our people in Scotland. And that's part of the reason, obviously, why I support independence, because I think you can only really tackle these issues if you have a joined up approach across all policy areas, particularly when you're looking to tackle poverty, because like I say, you're talking about housing, you're talking about social security, health, but also your economic ability to tackle all those areas and to take it all in the round is much more difficult when you only have 15% of social security powers and a very limited taxation powers as well. So it has to be the all-encompassing holistic approach to work.
And picking up on that, I hope that wasn't anything heavy. I did see it dropping down there.
No, it's one of the kids' artworks that the blue tack failed.
Oh yes, we used to have them. The ones I remember the best were what they called the gluings, and they were always gluings of like bits of rice or whatever. They get into the car and say, "I've got a gluing," and you always knew that there'd be the patter of little bits of rice all over the car as they got in. I noticed we've got another couple of questions. So this is obviously a lot of interest to our listeners today. So I'll read them both because it's around a sort of similar theme. Keith Barclay, how do we convince the electorate that Scotland is a financial net contributor to the UK rather than a drain in its resource? And from Stephen Aitkenhead, will this direct UK spending be taken from the so-called block grant? So let's bounce these around a wee bit.
Yeah, these are difficult areas because you know, they are complex. You know, when people talk about GERS and you know our tax base and relative to spending, it's very difficult then to extrapolate that into predictions for independence, because we're looking at snapshots in time in the devolved scenario. So, you know, yes, Scotland, you know, more than makes its way in the UK. You know, we perform from an economic perspective better than any other nation or region outside of the southeast, which is obviously a magnet and a vacuum to investment and to capital spending and all the things that we want to see distributed better. So it's complex to explain that. It is about an element of education and trying to boil it down into, you know, what matters the most. But, you know, the fundamental for me is independence gives us the power to choose on all these areas. And it's about prioritization. Politics and economics is always about what you prioritize. So at the moment, we're having to live within a fixed budget, and we're having to take decisions that are within a fixed budget, and we have to live within those means. We don't have substantial borrowing powers. Imagine what we could do, and look at what we are trying to do within that envelope. The Scottish Child Payment, the investment in health services, the investment in green infrastructure. Imagine what we could do if we're independent. And I was talking there earlier about the holistic, all-encompassing, you know, cross-departmental approach, where you're not just saying, right, your social security department is off doing this and your housing department's off doing this. If that was all joined up and working together in a more efficient manner and wasn't having to worry about bouncing off the DWP or the Treasury in terms of having permission to do things, and was able to join it up with our economic approach, which I believe should be about a well-being economy. It's not just measuring GDP. It's about, you know, how we make the lot of our citizens better, healthier. Then I think we're in a much better position. And you know, you only have to look at other countries across Europe and across the world in similar positions to see the possibilities that are there. For me, that's what it boils down to.
Yeah, I mean, and again, this is such an interesting area, because we know that some sectors of our community we'll talk to are interested in understanding it from a financial perspective. And one of the challenges is that the data that emerges, which you mentioned, GERS, there, Government Expenditure Revenues Scotland, when you get the data, it's looking at the statistics that were. And you also make the point that it's looking at statistics as being part of a UK framework, where many of the items appearing on GERS are estimates, and that they are deemed to have been spent on behalf of Scotland, not by Scotland. So obviously, if Scotland were independent, we wouldn't choose to spend the amount of money on new additional nuclear warheads, for example, that the UK government. Plus, you would like to think that they would run it more efficiently, because many of the departments, and they're notorious for this, if you look at some of the committee reports coming out of Westminster, that some of the public departments are notoriously inefficient, and we've talked about earlier decreasing levels of accountability. And you also make the point about, you know, well, what works for people, because it is quite complex to explain how it all works. And so some people will be very interested to know that. Other people will be much more gravitate towards the art of the possible. What could we be doing? And you've set that out very well. In terms of Stephen's question, will this direct UK spending being taken from the so-called block grant? Well, it's worthwhile bearing in mind that Stephen, the Tories for really quite some time have been bumping their gums about the Barnett formula, which is the mechanism by how funding is placed at the moment. They really want to get their hands on it because the Barnett formula recognises some of the geographical disparities, for example, that Scotland has and the lack of infrastructure therein. So they do want to try and change that. But the structural funds, for example, that Neil mentioned, well, that is money that should have been coming to Scotland for the Scottish government to decide how it's spent. So it is a matter of democracy and it is a matter of accountability. And these themes keep on emerging all of the time.
Sorry, Michelle, they've been doing their best, doing their damnedest for the last number of years, not just under Boris, but under Theresa May as well. Go back to budgets where they use their sophistry, their financial wizardry within the Treasury to ensure that the schemes that they're announcing are not Barnettised. So we're not getting the benefit of things that we should be getting the benefit of. And a classic example there is the money that was spent on the DUP's bung in Northern Ireland during the time of the Brexit negotiations, the £2 billion. Scotland was shortchanged by £4 billion from that. So we're never going to get a fair deal as part of the UK. No matter what the Scottish Tory MPs or MSPs say about how grateful we should be for the money that arrives back at our door, having been rinsed through the Treasury several times and come out cut to ribbons. We're never going to get a fair deal there. It's about controlling our own resources and deciding for ourselves by our own democratically elected politicians how this money should be spent and the priorities that we have for it.
I mean, and of course, I couldn't agree more. And I'll just say a last wee piece before we're going to show my crowdfunding video in a minute or two. But I strongly agree with you. And I suppose I have quite a deep fear now that the Tories will seek to neuter the Scottish Parliament. I don't think they would go as far as trying to close it down, but to neuter its capacity to deal with things differently, which was fundamentally the way it was set up. And I suppose in answer to the Tories, I often say to them, because they like to class themselves as people, they often have many business people who say, well, they're all into accountability, create a better life. And I always say to them, so why then, in the matter of the future of your country, do you abrogate responsibility for that future and give control to your nearest competitor who clearly doesn't have your interests at heart? And I have to say, I haven't found one yet that is able to answer that. But anyway, and we're going to move on after the showing of my crowdfunding video, which only takes about a minute and a half, 2 minutes maximum. So we'll just sit and you can enjoy some of the spectacular views of what I hope could be my constituency, Neil.
Fantastic.
This election is the most important in my lifetime. Scotland stands on the cusp of change. Without change and without the powers to make the changes we want to see, Scotland will be held back. We've been forcibly removed from the EU against our wishes. The cruel injustices of Westminster have been laid bare during the COVID pandemic. The Tories knowingly and deliberately work against the interests of Scotland, and the Scottish branch office of the Labour Party stands idly by. So this election is about choices, Scotland's choices. We need to choose the people we send to Holyrood, and they need to choose what to do when they get there. We need people who can deliver on Scotland's choices. We need people who can stand up and be counted. And we need people who will focus relentlessly on the North Star of self-determination. I need your help. I need your help to reach as many people as possible in Falkirk East and encourage them to vote SNP. Please support my crowdfunder. This election is different and it's more expensive. We need to use targeted social media and we need to deliver our leaflets via the Royal Mail. Please help. No amount is too small. Let's make Scotland's future about Scotland's choices. Let's make part of that choice Michelle Thomson representing the SNP in Falkirk East. Thank you.
That's a cracker.
Well, you would say that, but thank you very much. That's very kind. I've joked about it before when it was being filmed. It was an extraordinarily cold day by the coast, and the guy who was doing it was saying, "Now, Michelle, smile." And I was saying, "I can't smile because my face is going to crack." One of the areas I wanted to move on to now was to narrow and focus a bit in what you hope might your personal contribution be if you're successfully elected. We both know that there is a great deal of experience that has recently retired from the Parliament. Angus MacDonald, who I mentioned, who was the MSP for Falkirk East. You mentioned Alec Neil, Mike Russell, Jean Freeman, and so on. And we've got a very, very talented crop of people who are putting themselves forward, and we hope that the SNP will do very well. But there has been quite a move away of experience. So what are your reflections on that, and what is it you would personally like to hope to focus on in your own sort of field?
Yeah, I mean, you can add to those names like Bruce Crawford, who held the minority government that successfully held together that parliament for us between 2007 and 2011. You know, his ability to negotiate with other parties is going to be a big miss. Aileen Campbell, you know, there are so many, Stuart Stevenson as well, so many good SNP MSPs that we're losing this time round. And so, yeah, there is going to be a changing of the guard in some respects in terms of what our parliamentary group is going to look like, and in terms of how our Scottish Government is going to be formed if the SNP is successful. But that's going to be true of the Parliament as a whole. And I think the presiding officer, Ken McIntosh, said that it could be up to 40 new members of the Scottish Parliament this time round, which is, you know, almost a third of the Parliament is going to get turned over this time round. So that is a big, big change. And I think, you know, any healthy democracy, you always see change. You see fresh ideas, fresh faces, different energy, different priorities. And for me, my priority, I've worked very clearly on social security and anti-poverty issues. That's my driving force in politics, is to see a fairer society, a good society that treats its citizens well. It's the reason I believe in independence. I don't believe we get one without the other. I will obviously be looking to take an interest in that area. Also education. I've got a young family. I've got a personal interest in that in terms of the future of education policy. But also I can see some areas that I think we need to work on. You know, I look particularly in North Lanarkshire, my constituency that I've just resigned from at Westminster, but also the one that I'm seeking to represent at Holyrood, Edinburgh and Shotts. You know, there is an issue right now in terms of how we support children with additional support needs. And I think we really need to have a conversation about how that is going to work going forward on a national forum as well as at a local level, and ensuring that the support is there for children, teachers and families to ensure that we're getting the best for people. So, you know, obviously I hope the next Parliament is also going to be a Parliament defined by an independence referendum and about the policies that we would want to bring forward for an independent Scotland. I've sat for the last 2 years as Deputy Convener of the Social Justice and Fairness Commission, which is looking at policy areas just now in the devolved realm, but also most importantly looking ahead towards independence, that we can build a fairer, more socially just, a good society in Scotland. And that really is going to be, where I'm looking to provide my contribution as best I can.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I mean, obviously, I have quite a long hinterland in business, both working in large businesses and running a number of small businesses. And I am interested in the kind of financial elements. And I don't mean by that just supporting business. I certainly wouldn't characterize it as that. I think we need to understand and look afresh at our financial systems. The tendency has been that business is kind of over there, and it's been great to see how businesses have re-recognized, I should say, their role in society and how they contribute, and understanding financial matters, understanding how you can embed sustainability in communities by putting forward policy initiatives is an interest of mine. And I've commented on the record that I was surprised to see that there isn't a cross-party parliamentary group for financial matters in the Scottish Parliament, which I have to say I'm very surprised. And maybe it's been the case that because much of it is reserved to Westminster, we haven't looked at it. But if we're taking the mantra in general terms that we can vision and be audacious and ambitious rather, in terms of what we're trying to do for Scotland, we should do likewise in financial matters, because so many elements of our global financial system are broken as well. And so I'd like to look at that. The other area, which I think there's a bit of crossover, we have to look optimistically at some of what may come out of this pandemic. Now, we know there will be significant issues economically. We've talked about mental health and so on, but we also need to think differently about how we'll all live our lives. And there are some positives. For example, the world of work. Many people have realized that productivity hasn't plummeted because people have had the opportunity to work at home. Actually, the vast majority of people want to do a good job. They want to be able to contribute and so on. And I think that needs to be looked afresh. It also needs to be looked at in terms of public sector as well. Because people understand that their families are important, and then you link it to the likes of 20-minute neighbourhoods. Mm-hmm. Imagine the difference to some communities if people were actually working at home and then went out, to stretch their legs, to walk their dog and so on. They might pop into a local shop. So it's quite virtuous like that. And looking at that afresh, yes, we didn't choose this pandemic. And yes, it's been extremely painful and will continue to be for many people, but it does also present an opportunity as well.
Yeah, without a doubt. I mean, I think everybody during lockdown explored more of their own 20-minute neighbourhood, because our ability to go any further than that has obviously been curtailed. And so we've been able to see more of what's been on our doorstep in terms of nature and in terms of our ability to socialise, but also I think people have been reticent to go out in their cars as much, and they're wanting to walk to the shop as much as possible if they can, if they've got that locally. And actually, I think it's also breeding some social action locally. The realization that if I don't drive a significant journey, I don't have access to the amenities that really I would like to be closer to home. So like you said, the idea of 20-minute neighbourhoods, I'm very supportive of. It's something that we've looked at the Social Justice and Fairness Commission, as I said. It's certainly something that I think we should be looking at. And as you say, we didn't choose to have this pandemic, but from every crisis, we have to try to learn the lessons that and pick up on the areas that, in the terms of changes in behaviour, that we would want to see kept. Reducing the number of journeys that we're taking by car to help the environment, increasing the number of active travel journeys that we're taking in order to boost our physical and our mental health. Also, the changes in work practices. Now, there's going to be challenges there because, like you say, so many of us, myself included in my Harry Potter cupboard office under the stairs, have been working from home from more. But we've got a job to do to make sure that people aren't exploited as there is that far swifter transition to more flexible working than was anticipated. We have to make sure that people are protected and aren't exploited, and that we make the best of the situation rather than seeing people go through the worst.
Yeah, and there's a question actually just picking up on this from Jane Brackenridge. Do Neil and Michelle agree that the last year has demonstrated how important having strong local communities are?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, it's been fundamental. And this is, it's not just in terms of, the facilities and resources that we've got around about us, but it's also about, our social, our neighbours and the work that we've been doing for each other, looking out for each other. For so long, people, the adage was that you didn't know who your neighbour was, and you very rarely have conversations. I think that has definitely changed. We're all out on our doorsteps. We were all out, in the nice weather last year, enjoying it, and our only social interaction really was, across garden fences or seeing people out across the street. So yeah, definitely having strong local communities, that is definitely something that we're going to want to work on and ensure that we're facilitating that and supporting that as best as we can as well.
Yeah, no, and I made the point as we were going through that stage. I personally made a promise to myself that I would engage, if I was like out walking with a dog or something with people, I would take the time and trouble, particularly if they were on their own or they were elderly, that I would make sure I said hello to them. I had some conversation. I mean, there's the street next to where I live, there's an older lady often sits in her front garden just to enjoy the sun at a certain time in the morning, and I would always make the point and stop and having a wee chat with her, because I thought, well, for all I know, this could be the only social interaction she's getting, and it probably means the world to her. And also our local shop that, inevitably we're always kind of nipping up and popping into, thanking the staff there who, particularly at the start of this, it must have been quite nerve-wracking for them, and yet with just immense bravery, they were continuing to provide a service within our local community. And there was other examples as well. I've seen many kind of bodies setting up runs to organise food parcels and help the vulnerable in their community. So actually, I think it has really brought it home so strongly that there is such a thing as society.
Absolutely. But also it's been a bit of a recalibration, I think, for some people. In terms of who they deem to be key workers, and where our really important work is getting done. I think it's always kind of been there. I think most people really do value the work that nurses and doctors and our NHS staff do. But I think that there's been a definite shift in their prioritisation as to who really does the important work, and a greater appreciation. And that certainly is something that needs to be harnessed, because it's also followed on, while the polling shows a greater appreciation for our key workers, it also shows that there's a need for a recalibration in terms of the social security safety net, and the fact that it's been left with major holes in it by 10 years of Tory government. For the first time across the UK, polling is showing that people support an increase to social security support, and that is definitely something, as progressives, we absolutely have to harness and keep on arguing for, and make sure that continues to be the case.
Yeah, and underpinned by the kind of respect and dignity as to how you administer it, which I think is so important. I mean, I've had quite a number of inquiries about when the Scottish Government will complete the work for the benefit that will replace PIP, because people are so dismayed by what they've been subjected to, how they feel they have been demeaned in their treatment. It's really, really disgraceful. And of course, just this week at a blatant pop, we saw the very welcome promise of a 4% rise for our NHS staff as compared to the paltry 1% offered in Westminster. And I think that's really literally putting your money where your mouth is, and saying, not just saying we value these people immensely, actually awarding them. And I mean, everybody probably took part in the kind of banging of pots, and it was quite nice to see your neighbours all out doing that. So we've got 5 minutes left, and I feel as though I've asked you lots of questions. Is there any particular question you'd like to ask me?
Yeah, well, you've obviously spoken about what your priorities would be. I mean, are there local issues that you feel you would really be wanting to hit the ground running on, that you'd want to follow in Angus MacDonald's shoes with?
Yeah, I mean, one of the comments I've made about Falkirk East as a constituency is that there is a perception, and rightly or wrongly, I mean, I haven't spoken to enough people about it yet, that they feel disassociated from the centre, which for them is Falkirk as a town, because Falkirk East is a bit of a misnomer. It's not Falkirk, and only a bit of it is east of Falkirk. And it's also characterised by many different places that hold very fast and very strongly to their own individual identities. You know, they don't say they're from Falkirk or near Falkirk, they'll say where they come from. There's lots and lots of different villages. And one of the things I've been doing is doing a piece to camera every day. I've called it Around Falkirk East in 80 Days, and I've been talking about the history of many of the villages, and I'm doing Grangemouth at the moment. We've talked about industrial history. Tomorrow I'm going to go on and talk a bit more about INEOS, which is obviously, from a contribution to Scotland's economy, is hugely important, but the people in Grangemouth who live in Grangemouth have a completely different perception on what it means for them. They colloquially call it a kind of DIDO, drive in, drive out economy, because they're saying, well, we don't see the benefit of it. And I think recognising that, and therefore you're able to give voice to it. So some of the problems are similar, I guess, to what you would see in many other constituencies and similar concerns. Some of them are quite local. And I also mentioned ports as well. Of course, you've got the port, which is absolutely massive. And I've been pointing out that the port is privately owned. Margaret Thatcher sold off all our ports, they're national assets. And of course, they're now owned by funds that are headquartered offshore, and all that money goes into tax havens. I mean, it's completely ridiculous. There's been some issues with flooding, and I think we were in a meeting earlier where I was talking about the planning process is very, very complex, and where you've got flooding occurring in a number of different areas, that's something that's going to have to be looked at. So it's a complex constituency, and fundamentally the most important thing I've said is that each area must be able to make its voice heard. So therefore being very available, highly visible, easy to contact. So, I mean, I've been working away in my campaign for, quite a long time now. I've been, you can get me on Facebook, on Twitter, Instagram, email, and so on. But so it's probably some similarities with you as well. What do you see as your challenges for if you're elected, Neil?
Well, I think we share some of the issues around deindustrialization, obviously, and I was going to ask you about the need to ensure that our communities, not just in the northeast but across Scotland, are looked after, so that there's not this, with the move away from fossil fuels, so that there's not this similar 1980s-esque, scorched earth policy, and so many communities are left behind, because there is clearly downstream activity that comes through Airdrie shots and other parts of central Scotland, including Falkirk. So that's definitely going to be one. Obviously, the big issue over the last few years has been the future of Monklands Hospital in my constituency, and the fight that Alec and I have had to stop it moving to Gartcosh and keeping it in the Airdrie area. That is still going to be a focus of mine if I'm elected as the member of the Scottish Parliament, is about ensuring that the community are brought with the health board in terms of how the new hospital is going to look, but also what happens to the old site, because it's a strategically important site just on the outskirts of the town centre in Airdrie, and we need to make sure we get that right. But also, like you, I've got outside of the main hub, if you like, around Airdrie, there's also Shotts, a number of villages around Shotts, and ensuring that North Lanarkshire Council's plan for investment in new town centres takes the communities with them. I'm very welcoming of new investment coming into town centres. We need it. but ensuring that it's the right priorities again, and people have their voices heard about those processes, particularly in an area like Shotts, I think is going to be really important in the next Parliament.
Yeah, and we've got one minute left, and we haven't even touched on, which is another area to highlight, is how we can create a kind of golden Forth Valley, if you like. There's huge opportunity there when you link it to our green agenda, and we didn't even get to that. But what I did want to do was just to let my listeners hear a bit more about who my special guest is going to be next week. We're going to have Dennis Canavan, who is incredibly well known to everyone in the Falkirk area. As you know, he was a Labour MP for Falkirk West from 1974 to 2000, then a Labour Party, and then as an independent. He was a member of the Scottish Parliament, and then, of course, on the Yes Advisory Board. I'm very grateful for Dennis agreeing to take part, and also the endorsement he's provided for me. He's a fantastic guy. So that's going to be a great event next Sunday afternoon that I hope you can all enjoy. And just before we finish up, Neil, can I say thank you very much for your contribution today. It's been a great conversation. I think we could have carried on for another hour.
Thank you so much for having me, Michelle. Really interesting. I've really enjoyed it.
Yeah, and
thank you very much, and all the best.
Campaign.
Likewise. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you then. Cheers. Bye.